The Diamond Shoes by M. Rubio. There is only one valuable thing in art, the things that you cannot explain. Georges Braque. Part 1. Sold. The auction was already taking hours. The perfect organization, like all that Patricia used to participate in. The cream of São Paulo's elite was there represented, not to mention the international attendance. All details perfectly in the palace of the dancing birds. It had took many months of dedication, almost 24 hours a day. The reservation of absolutely all the palace premises in first instance had seemed unnecessary, even impossible. But the safety of the works and of everyone involved was fundamental, and as the organization was progressing, Patricia was absolutely sure that, without a doubt, all measures had been very necessary. She had already been responsible for many events, but none of such importance. Works amounted to many millions of dollars. In fact, everything in the event was calculated in dollars, and the official language was English. Patricia was born in São Paulo, the only daughter of artist parents, and had been very early contact with the history of art. These positions, in which her parents had participated, had nothing to do with the ones she currently was promoting. Economic difficulties were a constant in the family. However, living on art, almost impossible for contemporary artists, wasn't for both her father and her mother, renowned and relatively successful painters, overcoming all crises without departing from their personal legend. Long family conversations were always revolving around art. Her parents were experts of all painting techniques and knew the history of all great painters and their lives. They used to talk as if each of the great artists were from the family, and in this way they passed on to Patricia all the information she needed to later become an expert in the art world. Her scribbles on the screens demonstrated from the beginning that she hadn't inherited her parents' talent. However, far from taking her to the sadness of being unable to communicate through art, she dedicated herself to the study of the great with all her soul. She also had studied contemporary painters, their technique, their life, sometimes making analogies between them and those that history had highlighted. She always used to say that getting to know the works and the artists was an opportunity that she would be grateful for, never accepting to be named art critic. For her, criticizing works of art was a sacrilege that she didn't accept. She would not be the one to do it. Knowing the artists, the beauty of their works, their lives, in short, their history, led Patricia to better understand the history of humanity. This was what she wanted to convey to her students at the university. It was at one of the seminars she'd presented on Van Gogh that she'd met Paolo, the great love of her life. Van Gogh was her great idol, and the emotion she conveyed when speaking of him could be felt in the air. Having the artist been working in the art trade since he was 16, she used to feel a closeness to him, which she couldn't explain. Perhaps because, even though being a born artist, he knew how to value others, and he was accomplished considering the art trade as a wonderful business, which, according to his own words, the more you work on it, the more ambitious human being becomes. Patricia understood that her idol referred to ambition in the search of perfection, explicit in the artist's work and life. Although, later on, Van Gogh retracted himself, defining the art trade as a farce, Patricia ever analyzed with extreme kindness a life that she considered most exciting. It was just this emotion that Paolo felt in the air, which prevented him from leaving the seminar without a personal contact with the one that had made his heart beat for the love of earth. Paolo had stand so that Patricia had to pass him when leaving and whispered in her ears, "I invite the Japanese from the incredible clarity that all their works are impregnated. They are never boring or have the effect of doing them quickly. Their style is as simple and breathing." It was magical. Patricia immediately identified her idle words, and her attention turned to that guy who otherwise would be totally indifferent, who from that moment on became a part of her life, a breeze of emotion and love. Paolo was tall, dark-skinned, with brown eyes, looking more like the model than to the artist who could give life to the painting work. Their first encounters revolved around art, its techniques, and the influence it had on humanity. From the beginning, this was a point where each one maintained their own way of seeing. Patricia, deeply knowing history of art and the biography of absolutely all great people, used to believe that art in itself was a reflection of the artist's life of their time. Paolo could also be considered an expert, but he maintained that art romantic vision, the certainty that more than reflecting an era, it exerts a transforming pressure. The opinions' divergence, however, never gave rise to disagreements. On the contrary, they managed to hold long conversations, each arguing on point of view, but respecting the basis exposed by the other. Patricia agreed to pose and felt herself special. She undressed herself completely for the one who already had made her heart beat fast at each date, for the one who, from the first moment, had stripped her soul. When she examined the finished work, could feel the passion in each line. Her long hair, far from simply covering her real anatomy, had valued every curve, transformed every detail into a source of emotion, giving rise to imagination. Sex was, for the first time for Patricia, an explosion of sensations never before experienced. From that moment on, the long conversations had been replaced. They were no longer discussing their great idol's love. They were always avoiding other companies, seeking the intimacy of caresses, building their own love story. Patricia was surprised by her mother's reaction when she met Paolo. So, the one who was the greatest love of her life, who managed to capture the essence of her being on a screen, wasn't good enough for her? Why? Financial issues had never been an impediment to her parents' love story. They'd never allowed economic difficulties to change their own personal legend. Why would she have to change hers based on Paolo's lack of earnings? She knew that Paolo was phenomenal, that his art had soul, that very soon he would be recognized as an artist. Furthermore, as a professor at the university, her earnings were more than enough to start a life together, a life of love, passion, sensations. In 3 months, they were together, starting their own story. Evidently, all practical matters were left to Patricia. So it was with the small apartment rental, the electricity, water, and gas bills, also the supermarket, how much they could and could not spend. Patricia had chosen an apartment with 2 bedrooms so that Paolo could have his own studio. Nothing could be missing for him to reflect love, passion, life on the screens. Soon, he would be another great in the history of humanity, and Patricia would be part of his personal legend. The studio's expenses weren't controlled by Patricia, and the maintenance of the canvases, the paints, the models began to mean discussion moments. But she couldn't allow economic difficulties to interfere with Paolo's creation and their own love story. Now she was no longer his exclusive model. Christina was the main one, her muse. In rare inspiration moments, Paolo also was hiring male models, but even in these works, Christina was the central figure. The religious content of these creations, however, always were allowing for a worldly interpretation. Christina was always the angel, and the other figures were portraying doom, fallen angels, thirsty for sensations. When was arriving from the university, she was having the whole house to organize, clean, and the food to prepare. Only the studio was in charge of Paolo, since she, even out of respect, wasn't even entering it. It hadn't been an explicit ban. However, when she realized that her presence could interfere with Paolo's work, especially when working with models, she stopped intervening. Sex no longer had the same intensity, and Patricia began to realize that her fatigue and economic difficulties were generating this lack of interest. In one of her rare visits to her parents, Patricia commented the situation to her mother. She explained that there was no complaint, as she was very happy with her new life alongside her great love. But implicitly, she made it clear that she was admiring the enthusiasm shown by her parents during her childhood. Now, she could understand the effort to overcome so many financial obstacles and still continue on the path of their personal legend. Her mother had only heard her, did not argue, since she knew her daughter's essence very well. She knew that any found solution would be a consequence of her own analysis of the long arguments that Patricia used to keep with herself. So it was. Patricia decided that she had to get another job, something better paid, to be able to cope for a while with expenses, only until Paolo being recognized. When applying for the position in the History of Art auction team, she believed possible to combine her duties at the company with the university's classes. After all, professionally, these classes had always given her life. Whenever speaking about the big ones, she was feeling that emotion, which could transform her knowledge into part of history. Patricia was taking her students to feel such emotion and to be interested in the details that she considered a reflection of humanity in art. However, as her knowledge became more and more necessary to the company, her responsibilities increased, And as soon as she was able to act as responsible, she was forced to choose, since she needed to dedicate herself with more intensity. Her salary at the company justified the choice. She was supposed to receive a sales percentage at auctions that, despite appearing insignificant considering the values of the negotiated works, allowed the election. Her heart was crying when she said goodbye to the students. It had been a completely objective decision without the interference of emotions. It was pure math. How much do I need? How much time do I have? How much can I dedicate myself? But her heart was crying when she said goodbye to the students. 2 years had passed since Patricia started to be part of the team. Her knowledge was deeply valued, and she was actively participating in the selection of works, their evaluation, and their authenticity. Not to mention that her discreet personality was considered a plus, since she mostly was managing works belonging to personal collections, usually from families that didn't want to be identified in sales. However, this was the first time as the main responsible for an auction. Obviously, it meant a lot of work, a lot of dedication, but the whole team went to great lengths. Patricia had a team that admired her. They knew her capacity and were working for the event's success. The palace choice was the result of a heated discussion. Everyone, without exception, valued the beauty of the place, but not everyone had confidence in the safety they could provide to the works. Blocking all apartments for the event was one of the solutions found, and the date was chosen taking into account the first moment when this would be possible. But far from being satisfied with this resource as a unique one, Patricia hired a security company that could prepare an action plan and execute it with precision. The arrival of the works, their exhibition, the safety of the owners and guests, the delivery of the works in perfect condition to buyers, everything had been thoroughly studied and planned. The main hall, where the works would be exposed for a week, was supplied with a worthy of Hollywood and its creations security system. After 8 months of total dedication, all the works were about to arrive, all the owners properly hosted, including those who'd insisted on anonymity. Buyers had arrived from all over the world, including the Arab prince, with his entourage in diamond shoes, his cruise mega yacht with 9 luxurious cabins. He and his family had occupied the upper floor of the palace, previously conditioned to his requirements. Luxurious details had been introduced, creating a unique atmosphere. When everything was ready, Patricia spent some time admiring the result as if it was a work of art. Patricia was receiving personally all the works, determining where they should be exposed and verifying that the security was duly according to the initial plans. Finally, all of them were there. 2 dai Cavalcanti, 1 Tarsila do Amaral, 1 Ismael Neri, 1 Vicente do Rego Monteiro, 1 Cícero Dias, 1 Cândido Portinari, 1 Alberto da Veiga Guinart, 2 illustrations by Salvador Dali for the Divine Comedy, 1 Rembrandt, 1 Tiziano Vecellio, and 1 El Greco. All of them duly authenticated, their history, origin, and evaluation recorded. So they arrived. It was the only piece that didn't fit the exposition. From the beginning, Patricia found its inclusion strange, since she had never been aware of its existence. Their owners had demanded anonymity. For this reason, only the president of the company had dealt directly with them. Its assessment reached Patricia directly from the Spanish Gemological Institute, as well as its declaration of authenticity. But it was having a coffee with her boss, in a rare moment of rest, that Patricia heard its history. It was the story of a wrecked slave ship whose treasures had been rescued by a team of seekers who had strangely disappeared after it. It was said, behind the scenes, that the ransom was equivalent to a fortune, but that was carrying a black aura that reached everyone who approached them. They were the most beautiful pair of shoes that had existed in the history of humanity. Handmade on satin, fully embroidered with diamonds, one could only identify the satin in the ties that should be tied to the ankles of the happy maiden who would use them. Even after hearing their story, Patricia remained skeptical about treating them as works of art. But that was the prince's wish. He was there to, for whatever price, take that pair of diamond shoes to his own palace. For them, he had baptized his mega yacht in this way on his maiden voyage. Upon returning, he would take them to the luxurious surroundings they deserved, his palace. Patricia asked the box to be left still closed on the marble table that would accommodate them, and she went quickly home where she had forgotten some documents. When arriving, she went to the studio to kiss and embrace the great love of her life, to tell him about the great event, how everything was going perfectly, how it was promising to be a great success. She would tell how was feeling with the possibility of, with that, facing all the studio's economic demands. Patricia, as never before, was identifying herself with Theo, her great idol brother, who took care during his life to facilitate his economic condition, thereby allowing his creations. What her surprise was when she found him in the middle of sex with his favorite model, the one for whom she herself had prepared fat checks which were received from her hands. She knew Paolo's preference for her, since, according to his words, the model had an angelic air, easy to capture with light and primary colors. But there, when she found them, there was no light, and they were a long way from the palettes and the primary colors. Evidently, it had to do with primary sensations, with the primary behavior of animals. The model quickly got dressed and left. Paolo tried to explain himself. He wanted to make it clear that after all, he wasn't blamed for the betrayal, but yes, Patricia's absence, which the poor man had to endure daily since she was dedicating so many hours to her current job. Patricia listened to the clarifications very carefully, sitting on the sofa in the living room, since she had the sensation that if she would try to stand, she would faint. As soon as she felt stronger, she took a glass of cold water, took the documents she had fetched, and, addressing Paolo in a loud and controlled voice, told him that he had until the end of that afternoon to leave the house and take everything that was his. She made it clear that whatever found in the house which would belong to Paolo, including his works of art, would end up at the bottom of the river, his source of inspiration for so many works situated at the building back. A sadness never felt before invaded Patricia's heart on the way to the palace. She didn't know what to think, what she would do from that moment on, so she decided to focus all attention on the auction, which was almost starting. She would direct her emotion to the works, to disposition. She remembered all the beauty and history that was displayed there, and tried to dedicate herself entirely without thinking about her personal moment. Just was missing to accommodate the work, which Patricia insisted on not considering a work of art, and she requested the appropriated tools to open that box without danger or damaging the contents. When Patricia opened it, she could appreciate inside, through the Bohemian crystal cube, made specifically to rob the great beauty that they emanated, and then she believed it. Yes, they were a work of art. What a great artist would have made them! Once again, Van Gogh was there, present, and she'd remembered his words when entering the Jean-François Millet exposition. Yes, that was the emotion she felt when entering the palace exposition hall, so carefully prepared, and was facing with that beauty. Her soul repeated it over and over. Take off your shoes, because the ground you are going to step on is now sacred. I don't think we can separate art from human dignity and hope. Adrian Rich. Part 2. Sold. Anita Combo was there every morning, waiting for dawn and watching every tree, bird, the foam reaching her feet. She was so named because the gods had sent a gift at the very moment she was born. That chest contained such extraordinary beauty that her family believed that such an honor, coming from the seas, should be guarded with great care. From a very young age, she was returning to the beach every day, waiting for the next gift sent by the gods. Came a time when Adeto Combo started to believe that no other gift would come any longer. But anyway, she was coming back to observe the nature she ever loved so much. She used to play with the shells and the sea stars, coming to receive her every day and returning to her heart again, taking absolutely nothing. She believed that one should never take what is from the sea. It doesn't bring a good omen. Sometimes it brings gifts from the gods, which can be identified because they are different from everything that can be found there, even in its depths. But what belongs to the sea, there must remain. You shouldn't plunder its beauties, as it will come and get them back. Its giant waves take everything back. In time, Barak started to accompany her. There were only a few moons left for her to be able to have her own family, and Barak would be her companion, the one who would mean a blessing in her life. For this reason, he was now part of her morning ritual, always keeping her company and protecting her from any dangerous situation. The ceremony began with Barak showing his strength. He was already a warrior, ready to face enemies. His hunting was enough to feed his family. He had built his hut, but there was still a need to demonstrate that he could support and endure his wife. The trunk was chosen of same age as Adetokombo, and for 200 meters he carried it, running. He was ready to form his family with her. For her side, Adetokombo had already learned from her mother anything she would need. She already knew how to plant, harvest. She already knew all the remedies that nature could offer and how to use them. Their Buddhist painting, a secular tradition, was showing in their inspiring colors the future of that family that was about to start. But this time was different. In addition to all the rituals already known, the healer deposit in the middle of the village the honor received from overseas, that chest with the lid open, allowing to reflect the beauty inside it. The songs, the dances, the joy contaminated the sea, which was present, advancing with its white foam across the sand. When Aina was born, with the umbilical cord around the neck, Adetokombo went to the beach, thanking the spirits and the gods that she had survived. Then Analika arrived, though didn't wait too long. The happiness of that new family had contaminated the tribe. Adetokombo used to take care of her children very carefully and with great love. But although her activities took her almost every hour of sunshine, she never failed to approach her beloved sea every morning. Children now were going with her. Every afternoon, while the little ones were playing, the village women were gathering around baskets to make the flour that would feed their families. There, the older women passed on their wisdom to the young ones, their knowledge of nature and agriculture. Every day, everything was repeated, everything equal. Adetokombo was one of those spirits that worried the elders of the tribe, always looking for something new. wherever it would be, always happy, but with the certainty that the same gods who had bring her to her parents would send such a beautiful gift, or even more, for herself and her family. Therefore, every day she could be found observing the beauty of the gift of the gods. When on the beach, she used to keep looking for a sign on the horizon that could indicate that the sea was sending it, that long awaited gift. That day the sea was wroth. Sun God had hidden himself. The black clouds for a moment light up with launched rays, like arrows southing their objective. The elders advised Adetacumbo not to approach the sea, as the gods must be offended, and their spurs sought to do justice. But she wasn't afraid of the sea. It was her great companion since she was a child. There, she ever felt she could talk to the gods, looking for answers that not even the tribe elders knew. Not even the healer could give her the answers she was looking for, and she went there again, without fear, knowing that this time would be different. She stared, trying to detect a different sign, and that it was. The light sent by the gods in their golden arrows allowed to observe that spot in the distance. What would it be? Was her long-awaited gift coming? Her parents had often warned her that the gods had already sent her the gift, her life, and that she could offend them with her daily quest. But she knew they would do it again. She had that certainty in her heart, and every day was awaiting for it to arrive. It would be even more stunning. She was convinced of it. Like magic, the sky lit up. The clouds broke. God's sun was quiet again, allowed the day to come and illuminate everything around it. But that spot on the horizon was remaining. Adetacumbo should return and work on planting, harvesting, taking care of her children, her daily activities that had usually bringing her so much happiness. But she was there, with her eyes fixed on that sign that the gods had sent her, without being able to leave, without leaving her gaze. Gradually, she noticed that some small spots had been formed around the horizon, and that they were advancing, approaching the beach. Perhaps the gods were sending several gifts to everyone in the tribe, as there were many spots. There were certainly gifts for everybody. Gradually, She was no longer alone waiting. The whole tribe was there, waiting to receive their gift, the gift that the gods had sent. Now everyone was believing. As they approached, she could identify the gods themselves. She knew they were the gods because were dressed in that shining outfit that reflect the God's sunlight. All of them had their heads covered by something strange, whose reflection blinded those who were waiting for them. Perhaps the tribe wasn't worthy of staring at them. They were gods. Not even the tribe healer was worthy of staring at them. There they were, all petrified, waiting for their arrival. Adetokombo reassured her children, all clinging to her legs in fear of the unknown. She wasn't afraid. She knew that the gods were sending them the long-awaited gift. Then they arrived, and with them the destruction. Now she was believing that the gods were offended. What would the tribe have done that had so insulted them? Even before stepping on the sand, the gods were sending lightning bolts with fire, knocking down without mercy whoever they reached. The first to fall was Barak. He was at her side, always ready to protect her and her children. But he fell down, and Adetokombo was unable to receive response to her screams. Women, children, the wisdom of the elderly succumbing to the vengeance fire of the gods. What would they must do to deserve such punishment? Adetokombo looked again at her beloved sea, hoping that mercy, the forgiveness of the gods, and she clung to her children, covering their bodies, lest the fire of vengeance reach them. Then the gods approached, with very strong chains, impossible to be broken by mortals, chaining everyone they met on the beach. Some had managed to escape. They were speaking a strange language, the language of the gods, and no one could understand them. How could they defend themselves? How could they explain that they had no intention of offending them? All of them were taken away chained. Men, women, and children. The elders had all been eliminated by the fire of revenge. Adetokombo was in great pain, but she had managed to protect her children. With her body, she had managed to save them. She could observe the moment when the gods brought the chest with the gift sent by the gods when she was born. They seemed to be very happy. Maybe that was what they were looking for. Perhaps they were there to retrieve that gift. But she was in a lot of pain. Everyone was chained in the darkness. Would they be punished without the right to rebirth of their souls? What had they done? Captain Anderson had been in the service of the Crown for a long time. His activities in the slave trade had generated much wealth, for a long time well regarded by the nobility. His family was enjoying the fruits of his position of importance, always favored by the crown and the nobility. After all, he was one of the best. Little Emily was 6 years old when he met her. The long journeys only has allowed him to spend short periods of time with his family and civilization. He often looked at his crew and didn't notice the difference between those men and the savages he used to negotiate. At other times, he was absolutely sure that the savages who should be chained were them. But since he was a child, he loved the sea and the tranquility it gave him. He used to spend many hours on the beach, watching the sky with the certainty that one day he could see Poseidon. He believed that Poseidon was reserving him the compensation for his sad life, the hunger he was feeling. He had been abandoned by his parents at birth, and as long as he could understand his condition, he maintained the certainty that his salvation would be sent by Poseidon. When he was older, he started working with Captain Wesley, immediately being in his good graces. From the beginning, he was treated like the son the captain had never had. His marriage to the captain's beloved daughter, devoid of physical beauty but with immense goodness, was the breath of happiness he had waited for so long. When the fever consumed Captain Wesley during a trip in the service of the Crown, Captain Anderson took over, cheered by the crew. It came to be fully respected, since that was the will that Wesley had always shown. Poseidon had responded to his pleas. After a brief period, mourning the loss of his beneficiary, Captain Anderson returned to the port with the crown wealth and his own fortune. His travels became increasingly frequent and long. His crew, fearless and faithful men, only feared the mermaids, women so beautiful whose sun could take them to the bottom of the sea. They didn't fear storms. They ran to protect themselves from the calm, from the reflection of the moon, looking for where to hide from the mermaid's song, where it couldn't be heard. It was impossible to defend themselves against their charm. But the world was being modernized. The nobility was being charged for the source of their wealth, for a population divided between hunger and new concepts of humanity. Commerce had spawned a new class which yearned to be recognized. This new class, for the most part, had accumulated more wealth than the nobles themselves. Their children were attending the best schools, and the great artists were portraying the changes, generating a more modern vision of society. Slavery had been condemned in the modern world, and the slave trade became an illegal activity of which the court no longer wanted to be a part. This would be the last trip favored by the crown's money. Despite his arguments, he would no longer have their support, and Captain Anderson should prepare himself for economic bitterness in the future. For the news that arrived informing about of a savage tribe not yet converted to the faith was guaranteeing a less commercially advantageous trip. The attack had produced fruits worthy of a recognized and feared captain in the seven seas. The basements were full of savages, which in America would have their weight in gold. He knew that many of them would not arrive, and every day they were carefully inspected. Those who were succumbing to hunger and all who appeared to have been taken by fever were thrown into the sea. The crew had to be protected, and the last storm had howled. However, the captain was thinking what to do with the unexpected treasure found with the savages. What would a fortune like that do in a hut protected by barbarians? Should he also share such a fortune with a court that was abandoning him? Finally, the sighted land recovered general mood. Soon, everyone could return to on homeland, seeing their families again. The landing was very controlled. They had no information about the legality of their trade on the reached land. The exhibition was prepared, and the local traders were analyzing with great interest the physical condition of those who would be purchased. The teeth, the apparent strength needed for the work they would have to do. They were observing if they didn't bring any disease, if they had no trace of the fever with which the sea punished those who insisted on crossing it without permission. The sea wasn't indulgent with those who persisted in facing it without authorization. The auction result was splendid. The last to be traded was that savage with 3 little ones hugged around her waist. The captain had received an offer for the complete lot, thus avoiding having to liquidate the small ones, which had much less value. Thus, he started his way home already decided to only share with the crown that was abandoning him the fruit of the savage's sale. The valuable gift that Poseidon had reserved for him on that last trip would be a guarantee of wealth for himself and his family. Feeling the invisible and being able to create it, this is art. Hans Hofmann. Part 3. Sold. The birth of little Adele was an event in the kingdom. His first son, Pedro, had been a great joy for King Gustavo, the guarantee of succession. But Pedro had been born weak, requiring constant care from the doctor, who had to be so concerned for him that finished being invited to move to the palace. However, Pedro was a strong spirit. He resisted and straightened, being sure that, when necessary, he could assume the responsibilities of the kingdom. King Gustavo, since early, tried to provide the prince with all possible knowledge, discipline, method, and, above all, love of wisdom, would lead the young man to the necessary wisdom to govern his people. Science, astrology, arithmetic, geometry, grammar, and harmony were his constant companions. There was no time to be a child. Since his birth, he had to prepare himself for his destiny. Pedro was very intelligent, and very early he learned to communicate with his masters in their own language: a French master, an Englishman, and a German. Enthusiastic about the secrets that kept the ancient writings, he asked his father to be taught by a Spanish monk who would also instill in Pedro habits considered fundamental, such as affability, generosity, sincerity, moderation, and perspicacity. Bravery was already a habit in his life since his birth. Of that, King Gustavo was sure. Everything was different with Adele. Her blonde curly hair reflected the sunlight which was entering the room and coming towards her as if to greet her. The nurses were very careful when cleaning the folds that hid some impurities in her fat body, fat and healthy. Her little blue eyes mesmerized with their beauty anyone who dared to contemplate them. The king, much content, wanted to share the joy of the palace with all his kingdom and invited all his subjects to visit her. For 2 days and 2 nights, the little princess was the joy of the whole kingdom. Everyone wanted to see her, giving her a gift. Each one brought the best he had in his home: chickens, pigs, eggs, the puppy that would be his faithful companion, and that the queen baptized as Fiel. Others, thanking the king for the goodwill and prosperity he had brought to his people, performed samples of their work, and with great love had given to the little princess. Joiners manufactured and took cribs, chairs, a little wooden horse, which was immediately destined to the basement, because nothing that could mean any danger, anything that could hurt her, should be near to her. But what touched the kings the most was that diamond-encrusted tiara which the kingdom's silversmith had made. Certainly, he had spent all his life savings to make it. It looked like a work of art. Adele grew up and sprinkled joy and beauty wherever she was. The king used to accompany her in all activities. All the moments of his days were dedicated to the little girl, taking care of her education personally. Laughter and happiness took over the palace. Adele had also succeeded in making Prince Pedro's existence much smoother with her presence. Whenever she could, she was escaping and going to the immense library where she was finding her brother immersed in books in search of knowledge. Fiel was ever with her, and she started to spend a lot of time there, trying to understand the foundations of humanity, the understanding foundation. Fiel ever looked also to be interested in Pedro's observations. Both used to pay attention to so important ideas that the prince was sharing with them. For Pedro, those moments being Adele there, valuing and observing his knowledge, were a balm for his days. The cheerful and kind interpretations of the little princess of such serious and meaningful subjects even led him to reconsider some of his pondering. Her visits began to be anxiously awaited, as if a new master was. King Gustavo wanted to share the joy that invaded the palace with the whole kingdom. He had a great appreciation for his people and wanted to share his happiness with everyone. He started to parade every day with his carriage through the kingdom streets, allowing each resident to visualize the great Adele's beauty. But for the princess, that wasn't enough. She wanted getting to know each one, talking to everyone, having a more direct contact. And with great affection, she'd convinced her father to allow it. She asked the carriage to be stopped on each street so that the people could approach. But it wasn't enough, since everyone used to bow and didn't dare to speak to her. Soon, the little princess got permission to get out of the carriage, since she believed that staying on the same level as her people, they would be able to speak to her. But it was only when she broke the silence, addressing that young man that she had observed every day, and that he dared to answer her greeting, that the others also dared. The king, unable to disapprove his beloved daughter's actions, decided to find out who that young man was and his ancestry. He had seen a courage in him that, although respecting it, he believed should not be consented. The young man was the goldsmith's son. He had learned the profession from his father, and with his art was contributing to his family wealth, and with that also kingdoms. Born the same day as the princess, from an early age he was educated by masters, as his family accumulated the necessary wealth for it. The masters considered him one of the most intelligent young men with whom they had worked, being his intellect comparable to that of princes. With his skills and sensitivity when creating, he proved to be a born artist, to have in himself the talent that few could possess. The king, aware of Abner's intelligence and skills, tried to find a way to use them to his advantage, and invited him to create all the palace jewels. However, little by little, he kept away the princess' visits to her people, in order to avoid new situations that he didn't totally approve of. Abner's constant presence in the palace also seemed to him facilitating his intentions to avoid Adele's excessive contact with the commoners. But everyone had already learned to love her, and the princess already was loving her people so much that, far from abandoning her visits, she came to know each family, each worker, each child, and what they needed. She began to talk at length with Pedro, the future king, studying how his kingdom could even be more fair and loved. Now, Abner also was participating in those conversations. King Gustavo realized that despite the young age of Adele and Abner, their ideas deserved to be heard, and he began to pay attention to them. Their reservations regarding such friendship only started to exist when the walks of both began through the palace gardens. Such walks generated in the king a sensation of imminent danger. He had always considered himself fair and modern. He shared his joys with his subjects, allowing their economic activities to provide the necessary abundance to each family. What else could be expected of the king? However, news were arriving from overseas showing political changes that were worrying the royal families, not to mention the barbarian invasions news. But King Gustavo didn't believe that his kingdom could arouse the interest of invaders, and he continued to dedicate himself to maintaining prosperity responsible for so many years of peace. However, his advisors at one point began to recall the lack of an army. His guards, almost reduced to the palace, should once again be armed to be able to defend also the city walls. The king started to work on it, but the only way to get new guards was reduced to a few young people, not involved in commerce or family activities. He was supposed to get human resources outside the kingdom, and the only solution he found was to raise taxes. With the royal chests replenished, he could provide the defense of the palace and its kingdom. He believed that so many years of a fair and kind kingdom, which had generated so much wealth for all families, would now receive the fair and kind response from the people, a general effort for everyone's salvation. After all, everybody should feel safe. But, for the king's surprise, not everyone was happy to have to contribute. Some few families understood, but a large part of the people believed that other ways should be sought. King Gustavo wondered what ways could be. Abner arrived in terror, almost out of breath, as he ran without rest from the city to the palace. He wore fear on his face. As soon as he managed to utter a word, he told the king that everyone in the city was as scared as he was. They were under siege. The sea had gone totally overtaken by unknown ships. Their flags didn't resemble any of the kingdoms with which they used to maintain trade relations. In the distance, they seemed to be smaller than the boats that used to stop there from time to time, but the large quantity was imposing a feeling of insecurity never felt before. King Gustavo approached Mount Alamo with his guard, trying to confirm the information, and returned to the palace, pretending tranquility. After all, that fleet was remaining there, unmoved, without showing any imminent threat. Perhaps they would return to overseas without stopping any longer. Maybe they were there to replenish their food, the food that would allow them to continue the way to their homes. Perhaps they just would want to sell products brought in from India or China. Meanwhile, King Gustavo ordered the city gates to be locked, with a guard standing by, ready to defend them with own life. Any suspicious activity should be reported to him immediately. 30 days passed on without any change in the situation. His people couldn't have access to the plantations, all of them in the fields surrounding the city, and hunger was only prevented by the sale between neighbors of eggs and chickens. Eggs were sold at a good price. Laying hens were spared, but the rest were already freely traded at the price of diamonds. Every day the ships were observed very carefully, hoping that at some point they would be gone away, or that they would attempt the long-awaited invasion. However, day after day, they were continuing there, without moving, without threatening or withdrawing, as if there were no crew. Stories began to be told reporting ghost ships, whose captain was always a troubled spirit, with a crew that had disappeared in some storm. They would have met at some point in the firmament, and thus had gone to the kingdom. Now the fear of invasion was doubled, with the possibility of being taken by spirits tormented by their sins during a life. The courage that some showed in the beginning, with attempts to approach the plantations at night when the darkness could protect them from being identified, disappeared. Not even the exorbitant price that the few vegetables and potatoes had reached in the city market was animating such a feat. Only in the palace food didn't become scarce, since the king began to collect the taxes in provisions. One day, the residents realized that from one of the ships, a small boat with few occupants was leaving and headed for the beach. An emissary was sent urgently to inform the king what was happening. Evidently, a small boat with few occupants didn't mean an invasion, and the king went to the city gates to receive those he already was considering his visitors. Adele and Pedro also went in a carriage surrounded by the palace guard who could protect them from any unexpected danger. The visitors didn't appear to be part of any non-nobility, much more appeared to be barbarians, with their primary weapons and inadequate dress. But the king invited them to a banquet at the palace, where he could know more about those who had immobilized his entire kingdom for so long. A supper that boasted wealth, delicacies that could be served to the gods, and the new best wines that watered them. The visitors, despite not appearing to have culture or nobility, not even because of their clothes, behaved politely. King Gustavo realized that one of them, who wasn't speaking, was revered by the others, and this aroused his curiosity. He asked the interpreter, the only visitors speaking his language, who he was, and got confirmation. He was the king of distant lands, from where the visitors left, where their families were, awaiting for them. Adele, with her thirst for knowledge, immediately started asking about such lands, about their families, about their gods. She was delighted to know that believing in different gods was possible. The king of the far lands was for a long time observing Adele's beauty and intelligence, and then he uttered his first words, which sounded more like a condemnation. He declared that they had been willing to invade and plunder the entire city, its wealth, and also the palaces. He showed the king that in each of the ships there were 50 men, heavily armed, waiting for his orders to invade the now awakened city. It had been a strategy. He knew that no help could come that could disturb his plans. It would be destruction. However, his intentions had changed when he met Adele. He had succumbed to her charms and was willing to grant forgiveness and to retire with his own if the princess was his wife. The wedding would take place in his lands, according to his religion, since the princess at 12 would become his main wife. Adele felt all the sadness in the world breaking through her heart. She could no longer be with her family. She would no longer see her beloved people. From that moment on, her tears broke down and have not stopped anymore. King Gustavo tried to comfort his daughter, to make her understanding how much the palace and her people needed this sacrifice. He wanted to give her a farewell gift that could reflect all her beauty being unique, with no possibility of being copied or made in its own way. Something with such beauty that could represent her for all time. During one night, Abner made the requested by the king pair of shoes. Heartbroken by the sadness the young man was feeling, he obeyed the received orders. They should have been satin, completely covered with diamonds. It should be a work of art that could never be copied. His Adele deserved such dignity. The next day, Adele embarked, bound for the unknown, being able to take only a few personal items with her. Her tears didn't stop falling. Her only consolation was being permitted to travel with her loved Fiel. Her diamond shoes had been carefully packed in a chest, fully protected from any weather they might face. In the kingdom, Abner's disappearance was being already commented on, and there were those who guaranteed that King Gustavo, in his eagerness to prevent the work of art to be copied, decided that the creative artist should be drowned in the same sea that had brought those barbarians to his kingdom. Adele continued to cry every minute of every day. It would be a long journey. She couldn't eat, not speaking. She could only feel the deep sorrow that had taken over her heart. She didn't even feel the fear that spread with the storm, that with giant waves was engulfing each ship.